Welcome back to Primitive Organic Garden. Thank you all for tuning in. Today we're just going to do a real quick episode on tomatoes and 11 or 12 ways that you can grow tomatoes. The first way that we're considering, that you may or may not consider an actual way to grow tomatoes, is simply to allow volunteers to establish themselves. This tomato here was a volunteer plant. I didn't plant this, but it probably came from a seed of a tomato that I threw in the compost pile, or maybe I was eating a tomato outside, or the birds moved some tomato seeds around. A lot of times volunteers tend to be extremely hardy plants. Those seeds germinate where they want, when they want. They often tend to produce heavier yields at the end of the season, so I like to encourage volunteers. The second way that we'll consider growing tomatoes is in your compost pile. This was my compost pile 2 years ago. This past winter I used it as a salad garden for kale, collard greens, arugula. Right now it has 2 tomato plants in it, both of which volunteered. Here is one of the tomato plants. It's still fairly small. Here's another one of the tomato plants. That one's getting quite large. Had to stake it. One of the advantages of growing tomatoes in a compost pile is that you never have to fertilize them. The compost pile provides pretty much all the nutrition that the tomatoes could need. These are also in the shade, which means they're growing a lot more slowly, but they will continue to produce heat, to produce fruit through the summer months, through the heat, whereas some of the tomatoes that are in full sun won't do that. That brings us to our next method. Our third method of growing tomatoes is simply growing them in the ground. Growing tomatoes in the ground is probably the best way to grow tomatoes. It does require a lot of manual labor in terms of removing the grass, adding compost and manures to enrich the soil, planting, mulching. I do have a couple tomato plants here in the ground. I have one right here, a cherry tomato, and another cherry tomato here. For those, I basically use the hoe to remove the grass. You know, a rototiller is kind of a bad idea because you're basically chopping up all the grass roots and just spreading them around. I actually removed the top layer of grass with the hoe, then amended the soil with compost, manure, a little bit of perlite, some pot and mix, planted the tomatoes here. When they're in the ground, you know, the plants tend to be more vigorous, larger. They're never going to suffer from, you know, things like mineral deficiencies when they're in the ground because they can access a lot of nutrients. The one downside to having them in the ground is, you know, sometimes you do deal with things like soil compaction, and also if the leaves are too close to the ground, they can get foliar diseases. The next method that we'll talk about will be growing tomatoes in raised beds. I have 2 different types of raised beds. This is a standard raised bed here. I mainly devoted this to corn. Basically, this is the same type of plot as the one we were just looking at, but I put wood around it and filled it in with a couple inches of compost. I got a nice tomato plant here growing in the raised bed. Some of the advantages to raised beds, you know, you add a whole layer of organic matter. A lot of times the plants, you know, drain better in a raised bed. The soil warms faster. But this plant here seems to be doing okay. Not much better than the plants that are in the ground. That brings us to our next method of growing tomatoes, which would be in a hugulkultur plot. Hugulkultur is a great way to grow tomatoes because tomatoes like the soil to be consistently moist. With hugulkultur, you have that layer of rotting wood and sticks and debris at the bottom of the plot, which acts like a sponge every time it rains and soaks up moisture. Here I have about 10 tomato plants in the hugulkultur plot. I can plant those this close together because the hugulkultur plot is extremely nutrient dense. There's no shortage of water or nutrients, so the plants can be very close together. I got 10 of them side by side. Those are going to be great tomatoes. There's not really a whole lot of downsides of a hugulkultur plot, except for it is a lot of work to get it established. That brings us to our next method of growing tomatoes, which would be in a permaculture guild. This is also one of my favorite methods. Permaculture guilds are a great way to design your garden plots. This is my permaculture guild with my loquat tree. Some of the perennials in here, in addition to the loquat tree, are I have asparagus, I have oregano, I have some mint. This particular season I decided to plant some cherry tomatoes around the loquat tree. I got about 10 cherry tomato bushes. They're all doing well. They're starting to put on fruit, starting to have some fruit ripening up in here. That brings us to our next method of growing cherry tomatoes, which would be in cinder blocks. Growing them in cinder blocks is a very affordable way to grow cherry tomatoes. The cinder blocks are only $1 or $2. You can get pretty large plants just in a cinder block, but you do need to make sure that you provide weed control by hand weeding or mulching around the cinder block, because the plant's roots are going to extend through the bottom of the cinder block into the surrounding area. This is a plant that I planted in basically about 75% chicken manure and about 25% compost. This plant seems to be doing pretty well. I got some really large cherry tomatoes on this side of the raised bed that are planted in cinder blocks. Those are doing quite well. That brings us to our next method of growing tomatoes, which would be in clay pots. I think terracotta clay pots are a much better option than plastic buckets for a lot of reasons. They provide better capacity for gas exchange, air root pruning. The plants can breathe a little bit better. Here I got a tomato plant in a clay pot. I got a couple more. This is a pretty large cherry in a very small clay pot here. Got another cherry tomato in a clay pot. The one downside to the terracotta clay pots is you do have to water them more often. That brings us to our next method of growing tomatoes, which would be in the 5-gallon buckets here. This method requires kind of a large amount of soil to fill these 5-gallon buckets. If you're using something, real nice, like a high-end potting mix, or I've been using Stout Ollie's Mater Maker compost, which is fish and cow manure and composted green plant material. It does cost me about $4 to fill this bucket up with nice compost. If I go to the county landfill and just get regular compost from the county landfill, it's only 25 cents to fill up the bucket, but then I have to amend it with perlite and chicken manure and the like. I think the 5-gallon buckets are good if you're growing sandwich-sized tomatoes, but other than that, I think the smaller buckets are probably a better option for smaller scale tomatoes. That brings us to our next method of growing tomatoes, which is in the small buckets, or I've been using the 2.5 gallon buckets that I get from the Dollar Tree. These are small buckets. They're only $1 a piece. It doesn't cost me nearly as much to fill them with soil. And as you can see, I got a huge cherry tomato vine that's probably about 6 feet now, and it's growing happily in that small little 2.5 gallon bucket. Saves a lot of money. So far we've talked about nearly a dozen methods of growing tomatoes. We've talked about allowing volunteer tomatoes to grow where they are. We've talked about growing tomatoes in the ground, whether you direct seed them or transplant them to the ground. We talked about growing tomatoes in a raised bed. We talked about growing tomatoes in a compost pile. We talked about growing tomatoes in a hugulkultur plot. We talked about growing tomatoes in a permaculture guild. We talked about growing tomatoes in terracotta clay pots. We talked about growing tomatoes in big 5-gallon plastic buckets. We talked about growing tomatoes in small 2.5-gallon buckets. You can also grow tomatoes in like a hydroponic or aquaponic type of system. This is my rooting bucket. Mainly this is just a bucket full of rainwater and a little bit of compost, and I put an air stone at the bottom, and I root tomatoes and peppers in it. Right now I'm rooting some mint. You could also grow a tomato plant in a system like this, as long as you provided support for the tomato and had adequate nutrients, which could be anything from compost to molasses to any type of liquid organics. So hope you enjoyed this quick video update. We're basically just talking about 11 or 12 ways to grow tomatoes. A lot of people think they can't grow tomatoes, but you can find a way. You can throw seeds around your compost pile and hope for volunteers. You can plant in the ground, direct seed or transplant. You can grow your tomatoes in a raised bed. You can grow them in a hugulkultur mound. You can grow them in a permaculture guild. You can grow your tomatoes in a clay pot. You can grow your tomatoes in a 5-gallon plastic bucket. You can grow your tomatoes in a small 2.5-gallon bucket from the dollar store. You can grow your tomatoes in a permaculture guild. You can grow them in a hydroponic rooting system. You can companion plant your tomatoes with your corn. You can do whatever you want with your tomatoes. Plant them in cinder blocks. But at the end of the day, you gotta find a way to plant some tomatoes, because there ain't nothing like homegrown tomatoes.